I still remember that fateful evening as if it were etched in scarlet fire across my soul, when my wife looked me in the eyes and declared, "I'm not your property." Those words, cold and unyielding, reverberated in my mind long after they were spoken, shattering the comfortable illusion of control I had always believed defined our marriage. In that moment, everything I assumed about us, the roles, the routines, the unspoken expectations, cracked open. And so, with a mixture of bitter defiance and wounded pride, I decided to show her that I was no longer bound by those outdated ideas. I changed the locks on our home, cut ties, and declared, "You're no longer my responsibility." What followed that night, and the painful journey thereafter, left me both broken and paradoxically, strangely free. For years I had prided myself on being the steady provider, the reliable rock, the one who took care of everything in our life together. Our home had been our sanctuary, filled with quiet dinners, predictable routines, and the unspoken understanding that I was the one who should be in control. I had internalized the notion that marriage meant ownership, that a wife was, in a way, a possession, a part of the carefully curated life I managed with order and precision. I never questioned it, not until the day she challenged it. It was an ordinary Thursday evening when it all came crashing down. We had returned from a family dinner, our laughter still echoing in the car, when suddenly, without any preamble, she looked me square in the eyes and said, "I'm not your property." Her tone was neither angry nor pleading, it was matter-of-fact and liberating. In that moment, every expectation I had ever held about our roles melted away, replaced by a startling clarity. I felt a tumult of emotions, shock, confusion, and an unbidden pang of humiliation that I could neither understand nor deny. How could the person I'd loved and trusted so completely cast aside the comfortable, predictable life we'd built? My heart pounded as I tried to process her words. The days that followed were a blur of silence and introspection. At first, I attempted to ignore the new reality. I continued to wake up each morning to our shared routines, yet there was an undercurrent of tension that I couldn't quite ignore. My wife, now more distant than ever, spent long hours away from home, claiming she was working late or with friends. I tried to rationalize her absence, clinging to the hope that this was a temporary phase, a momentary rebellion against the routine we had come to accept as normal. Deep down, however, the seed of doubt had been planted. Had I, in my steadfast determination to control every aspect of our life, made her feel trapped? I began to scrutinize every detail, her late-night phone calls, the way she'd glance at the window as if longing for escape, the subtle shifts in her smile that now seemed tinged with a secret sorrow. My thoughts became a relentless loop of what if, and why. Every memory of our happier times, quiet mornings in bed, shared meals at our favorite diner, the simple, unadorned comfort of a loving partnership, turned bittersweet. I realized that I had built my identity on the assumption that I was the protector, the one responsible for maintaining order and harmony. But what if that responsibility was a prison for her, too? Late one night, as I lay awake in our now eerily silent home, I could no longer ignore the gnawing sense that everything had changed irreparably. In a moment of dark resolve, I decided that I needed to reclaim some control over my own destiny. I retrieved a set of new keys from a drawer in our study, the keys to a home that, from that moment on, would belong solely to me. With trembling hands and a heart heavy with both anger and sorrow, I went to the front door and changed the locks. Each click of the new mechanism was like a final punctuation mark on the end of a chapter one never wanted to close. I didn't know then whether this act would bring her back or push her further away. All I knew was that I could no longer allow myself to be defined by the roles and responsibilities that had been assumed in our marriage. The old rules, which I had clung to with such stubborn pride, suddenly seemed archaic and suffocating. Changing the locks was not simply about security, it was about drawing a line in the sand, about saying that I was no longer willing to tolerate a life where I was expected to be the sole caretaker of a relationship that no longer honored mutual freedom. When my wife returned that night, she was startled to find that the door no longer opened with the old keys. I stood in the hallway, the glow of the overhead lights casting long shadows on my face. Her eyes widened in disbelief as she fumbled for her phone, her usually confident demeanor replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice a mixture of panic and defiance. I replied simply, "I changed the locks, Marianne. You're no longer my responsibility." The words, though measured, cut deeply. In that charged moment, the gulf between us widened further, a gulf built on shattered trust and the irreversible consequences of pride. The ensuing silence was overwhelming. Our family, our routines, our shared history, all of it was now tainted by the bitter taste of that decision. I felt a pang of regret, not for the act itself, but for the realization that the woman I had once loved was now a stranger whose choices had led her down a path I could no longer follow. Her eyes, usually so full of life, now looked distant and pained. For the first time, I truly saw the cost of my own rigid expectations, the way they had suffocated the very relationship I had tried so hard to protect. In the days that followed, I was forced to confront a myriad of emotions. I oscillated between anger and despair, guilt and a grim sort of relief. I reached out to close friends, seeking solace and understanding, but found that the rawness of my pain was something I had to endure alone. I spent countless hours wandering through the empty rooms of our home, each step a painful reminder of the life we had once shared. I tried to fill the silence with work, with distractions, but the memory of that night, of her words and the shock of the changed locks, remained a constant, haunting presence. That pivotal act, meant to reclaim my autonomy, became both my salvation and my curse. It symbolized the end of a marriage I once believed was unbreakable and the beginning of a long, arduous journey of self-discovery. I began to question everything. Had I been so consumed by the need to control our home that I failed to nurture her need for freedom? Was our love so fragile that one act of rebellion could shatter it beyond repair? These questions tormented me as I tried to piece together the fragments of our broken dreams. In the solitude of the following weeks, I immersed myself in reflection. I read books on relationships and self-improvement, trying to understand where things had gone so wrong. I sought out a therapist, desperate for guidance in navigating the labyrinth of guilt, betrayal, and loss that now defined my everyday. In those sessions, I began to see that our marriage had been built on unspoken expectations and rigid roles that neither of us had ever fully understood. My insistence on being the protector, the one in control, had blinded me to the ways in which Marianne had longed for her own independence. And perhaps in our own way we had both contributed to the eventual collapse. She by seeking freedom outside the confines of our relationship, and I by holding on too tightly to an outdated notion of ownership. The more I delved into my own emotions, the more I realized that the night I changed the locks was a turning point, not just for our marriage but for my own identity. I began to see that I had allowed myself to be defined by the failure of that relationship, by the harsh words that had been spoken, and by the deep, searing pain of betrayal. But I also recognized that every ending is a prelude to a new beginning. I started to focus on rebuilding my life, not in the hope of reclaiming what was lost, but in the determination to forge a new path, one where I could rediscover my own worth, free from the shackles of past expectations. I returned to work with a renewed sense of purpose. My professional life, which had once been a refuge, now became the arena in which I would channel my pain into achievement. I set ambitious goals, not to prove anything to anyone else, but to prove to myself that I was capable of rising from the ashes of heartbreak. Every successful project, every accolade, was a small victory against the bitterness of that night. Slowly, I began to see that while the hurt of betrayal might never fully vanish, it could be transformed into a force that propelled me forward. As spring crept in and the cold of winter gave way to the gentle warmth of a new season, I noticed subtle changes in my inner world. The images of that night, though still present, began to lose their paralyzing grip. I found moments of quiet hope in the simple pleasures: a morning jog in the park, a shared laugh with a supportive colleague, a thoughtful conversation with a friend who had walked a similar path. I even started to write again, not the bitter, anguished notes of the early days, but reflections on growth, lessons learned, and the slow, steady journey toward redemption. One evening, after a particularly moving therapy session, I sat on the back porch of our home, a place that had once echoed with shared memories, now quiet and empty, and looked up at the sky. The stars were bright, unwavering in their distant glow, and in that moment, I felt a stirring of resilience deep within me. I realized that I was not defined by that one act of defiance or by the harsh words exchanged in a moment of betrayal. I was defined by every decision I made thereafter, to seek healing, to build something new, and to reclaim my dignity piece by piece. In the ensuing months, I gradually rebuilt my life. I began to explore new hobbies, meeting people who shared my interests and values, and even ventured out on dates with the hope of finding companionship that wasn't tainted by the past. Each new experience, however small, was a testament to the quiet, persistent force of self-reinvention. I learned that while I could not undo the past, I could create a future that honored the lessons it had taught me. As my professional achievements accumulated and my personal growth became evident in the lines on my face and the steadiness of my gaze, I reached a point where the deep-seated pain of that night no longer ruled me. I had learned to live with the scars, to see them as marks of survival rather than failures. I had come to understand that the journey to redemption is long and often painful, but it is also transformative. The betrayal that had once threatened to destroy me had, in a twist of fate, given me the strength to rebuild a life defined by authenticity, resilience, and self-respect. I still think of that night from time to time, of the echo of the changed locks, of the silent, broken promises that hung heavy in the air, but now those memories serve as reminders of how far I've come. I have learned to forgive not just my wife but also myself for the mistakes that once seemed insurmountable. I have chosen to see every tear as a step toward healing, every painful memory as a lesson in growth. Today, as I sit at my desk with the soft hum of the evening around me, I feel a quiet, unyielding hope. I know that the path ahead will still be lined with challenges and moments of doubt, but I also know that I have the strength to face them. I have reclaimed my identity from the rubble of betrayal, and though the journey is far from over, I now walk with a renewed sense of purpose and a heart that, while scarred, beats with the promise of a brighter tomorrow. In the end, I have come to understand that true redemption is not about erasing the past. It's about integrating it into a broader narrative of survival and growth. I am not defined by that fateful night, nor by the words that once shattered our love. I am defined by every day I choose to rise, by every moment I choose to rebuild, and by the quiet conviction that, no matter how deep the wound, the human spirit has an incredible capacity to heal.